Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Robbins, SIP Forum President and Managing Director. Welcome back to the Stir Shaken Enterprise Summit, the last session of the day. That's between you and a martini. I'm sorry, but it's going to be worth it, trust me. It is my great pleasure to welcome an esteemed panel. The session's entitled Establishing Trusted Relationships Among Service Providers. It's moderated by Christopher Otway, who's Associate General Counsel at Verizon and a director with the SIP Forum. Hi, Christopher.
Mark.
Our panelists include Sarah Delphey, who's VP of Trust Solutions at Americal. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Mark.
Also, Josh Burku, who's VP of Policy and Advocacy at US Telecom. Hey, Josh.
Hey. Hey again.
It's been a long time no see. And also Campbell Massey, Director of Regulatory Policy, North America at GSMA. Hey, Campbell, how are you?
Doing well. How are you, Mark?
I'm doing okay. And finally, Elizabeth Gray Nunez, Legal Counsel at Verizon. Hey, Elizabeth, welcome.
Hey, Mark. Thank you very much.
All right, Chris, I'm going to hand it over to, I guess, Richard to make a few remarks.
First of all of you, thank you very, very much for agreeing to participate, in this summit one way or the other. As Henning Schultz accused me today of being, the new bellhead. That's sort of where we're generally at these days, but the subject matter that you folks are talking about is vitally important. We need to establish trust up and down the food chain and the ecosystem, and know your customer. And Chris, this initiative is absolutely marvelous. So we're delighted to give you a platform now and a platform forever, really to establish this principle on a forward-looking basis. So on that happy note, speaking as a new bellhead, Chris, we'll drop off and let you just take over.
Thank you so much, Richard, and I really appreciate you guys letting us put together this panel. I am really excited about this, and what I'm excited about is that the topic of this panel is getting to an end game on robocalls and really getting into the point where we're really cleaning up the ecosystem. A lot of what we talk about in this forum involve tools that are also very helpful. I mean, we've done a lot on Stir Shaken, on RCD, et cetera. A lot of the tools that we have are involved, have to do with elevating trust in the good calls. And what I want to talk about here is getting the bad calls off of our networks. And the FCC is on the right path, I think, with a lot of its thinking on this. But I think industry really needs to step up and do its part to make sure that we can achieve that goal. And Josh, thanks for agreeing to join. I know you're back to back here. You talked in your last panel about the ITG, the Industry Traceback Group, and largely talked about how it's a really great tool for helping investigators investigate what's going on, and the tool itself is often disruptive when tracebacks are out there. I would love to get your thoughts on how ITG can also be leveraged in the trust context in terms of, figuring out what service providers can be trusted to not look the other way and take bad traffic, figuring out what service providers are looking the other way and taking bad traffic, and maybe who's in the middle. And so if you could sort of run with that as a starting point, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for including me on this panel and putting me on that back-to-back. But, as a starting point, I think when we think about traceback, I talked in the last panel about that point exactly. It's an investigative tool. It's a disruptive mitigating tool as well. But what it fundamentally is to me is the start of an accountability framework, because what you said is exactly right. a provider, an originator, wherever you are in the call path, you could, before traceback, before stir shaking, before all of these measures aimed at increasing accountability, put your head in the sand and say, hey, I didn't know it was on my network. So traceback starts to crack at that. Stir shaking does as well. So I really think that's what we're all trying to achieve here, and all these different pieces are tools to that. One of the things we hear all the time from providers and policymakers is you're sitting on all this data of who's good and bad. Can you get it out there? Why aren't you getting it out there? So one of the reasons we haven't just sort of put it on blast today is I don't think it's that simple as good and bad. We talked in the last panel a lot about how things have evolved. We went from, very easy for me to say who participates and not. That's in the trace stack. That's really binary and simple. But what about the hundreds of providers that participate every day, but show up as the point of entry or downstream from an origination point? All of these things. Are they good? Are they bad? Maybe, I don't know, maybe some context. So I think that creates some challenges about making sure we get this right. I like to think there's a few different categories of what we see in traceback that I think is a good baseline for this discussion. So we know there are bad actors out there, pure bad actors who specialize in trying to find ways to get illegal traffic, whether it's high volume, deceptive, scammy telemarketing like the auto warranty campaign, or pure fraud like Amazon calls to subscribers and get them on get them on Verizon's network, get them on other networks. That's what they do. They use shell companies. We've seen them use imposter companies where they pretend to be. They found an entry in the robocall mitigation database, launched a new entity with a hyphen in the domain, things like that. Pure bad actors. Everyone who's a good actor in this industry wants them out of the business. There are others that I think may have long operated in more of a gray area where they didn't know, or maybe they didn't want to know, but they were big enablers of the legal traffic. And then, of course, there's the providers that spend a lot of effort, money, time, cut revenue to do everything they can that this stuff doesn't get on their network. And I think what we're trying to gear towards is how do we put that middle category in a position to pick a side, if you will. If they're going to really be a true bad actor, that this is really their business to make money off of legal calls, then we need to expose that and get them, eventually out of the business, or give them the tools they need and help them get onto the right side. So that's a lot of how I think of that. So what we're doing with that is we know we sit on a lot of valuable data. So while I'm not sure getting it out and just publishing it's the right way, we do know it's valuable. We do know it can be very important for exactly what you said. So we've our Traceback Insights initiative, we've hired some data scientists to really dig into our data, see about the different metrics, probably a few different metrics that we would develop that, again, I'm going to go out of my way and preach it to everyone. It's not saying good or bad. There's a lot of things we don't see, and I think Liz and others will talk about how some of those things that you guys are thinking about in Glitter are things we don't see and don't have insight in. But I don't know what percent of traffic the tracebacks are. Was it 1% of that call flow or 100%? I don't know. I can make assumptions, but I don't have any data on that. But that said, so we're looking at how do we turn our data set into something a little more sophisticated, a really useful tool, not saying, again, categorically good or bad, but something as a provider that can feed into their broader due diligence process, feed into, hey, is this someone I want to do business with or not? Is this someone I want to ask more questions about? Not. Maybe they score a little low. What's the reasoning? And just really more of a starting point that can be taken into more context. So it is something we're really excited about, and I think very complimentary to what you guys are all working on with Glitter.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think that's very exciting. As you know, we're big proponents of moving in that direction, cautiously and thoughtfully, as I think you're doing. But it's crucial, I think, to start leveraging the data that you've got in ways that can help with building trusted relationships. Elizabeth, can you maybe talk about KYC, both from a Verizon point of view, but also kind of what you see in the ecosystem and deficiencies that you may see in sort of existing KYC opportunities and practices?
I would love to, Chris. Thank you so much. And thank you, Josh, for really highlighting the ways that, you know, it's not a simple yes or no or up or down in this space. And I think we all, as we've joined together in the fight against robocalls thus far, we've all learned that. And in part, that's because we've learned it through the experience of having really dug in with a lot of solutions, both some of them directed by the FCC and some of them coming from industry, just from our own desire to stop this scourge on our networks and this thing that continues to be the #1 problem that many consumers cite as the thing that they wish they could change about the state of telecom services today. So, you know, when we talk about know your customer, really what we're talking about is making sure that as a company, you are confident that the traffic that you are passing into your network from upstream, if you think of, you know, upstream versus downstream, meets certain standards of care around this and other issues. So, you know, I think that one of the challenges that we've had in this space is that there aren't a lot of good proxies for what does it mean to be a good know your customer, you know, what does it mean to be a good actor in the space? What does it mean to be a bad actor? This is a problem that has developed really quickly. And so it's a problem that I think, you know, it's not something that any of us could even have really conceived of 15 or 20 or 30 years ago in the way that it is now just a kind of an annoyance of everyday life. Chris, can we go, are you controlling the deck? Can we go to the next slide?
I think so. Hold on.
The slide 2. Okay.
Can you see that?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Awesome.
Let me-
Awesome.
Hey, Chris, if I could interrupt just for a second, if you could go to slideshow mode on your deck, then we won't see this, you know, the top and bottom and sides.
Let me see if I can do that. I apologize. You
I'll keep
have
talking. No, I'll keep
non-technical.
talking while you do. So you know, the FCC,
I'll work
I
on
think,
it.
has recognized that this is absolutely the #1 issue that consumers complain to them about. It's the #1 issue that consumers contact their policymakers about at a state and local level in the telecom space. And so the FCC has taken some pretty significant actions. They've got the robocall mitigation database, in which providers have to register, and they also have to provide a certification that they have a program to mitigate robocalls. And that also means that they have to terminate providers that the FCC has flagged, and they've actually just started doing this. It's very exciting. As being, you know, as being quote bad actors, or as not taking enough action to stop robocalls, or even knowingly allowing fraudulent or otherwise illegal or spoof traffic to come through their networks. Sometimes I think of that as looking the other way. Sometimes I think of that, you know, there are some folks that actually do it with knowledge. And I think the FCC has really focused on that latter category of really, you know, what we think of in the telecom space as really bad guys. And that is a lot right there. But the fact of the matter is that Verizon, at least, have determined that that is not going to be enough. Having this database, having this voluntary certification, I think the industry has already discovered that one person's good robocall mitigation program might not meet the standard of care that everyone expects in the industry. And there are a lot of different holes that you have to plug in the wall to actually keep bad traffic out. So at Verizon, what we have done is we've stood up a dedicated Know Your Customer team, and they have done a lot of different things to vet and in some cases, occasionally even terminate wholesale customer relationships based on patterns of traffic that we have seen coming into our network. So if our security, if our fraud teams, if the analytics and software that we use to analyze the patterns coming through our network, if they identify that a certain customer is continuing to pass that traffic through, especially if we've alerted them, we will terminate that relationship, because it's not worth it to us. It's because it ends up being our reputation as Verizon that interfaces directly with the end user who is receiving that call and who is losing trust in not just Verizon, but also in the entire ecosystem that is voice calls. And, you know, I could talk a lot more about how I think that contributes overall to an atmosphere of losing trust that we all used to take for granted as common shared norms. So in the effort of fighting back against that with data, we have partnered, extensively with the ITG. We are one of the participants who feed data into the industry traceback group's honeypot, and we work with them, and then the industry traceback group works with all of the collective data that it gathers to trace the origins of bad traffic and actually find the bad guys, and then work with law enforcement and state attorney generals to go after them and actually prosecute them. Because at the end of the day, somewhere at the other end of all of these jumps in the path are actually bad guys that are trying to defraud people, and they wouldn't do this if it weren't successful. Unfortunately, it's really easy to press a button and send, deploy 10,000 calls, and if you get 1 or 2 bites from that call and you make $1,000, that could be $1,000 in an hour. So the economies of scale are one of the things that we as an industry are really still working through. How can we fight against that in the most effective ways? One of the challenges there is that it's what I like to call the money laundering problem. Chris and many others on this panel have heard my metaphors, but one of the challenges that providers in the US have is that we may fire an upstream customer for sending us bad traffic. And what that provider can do is go find somebody else who's still one of our upstream customers to send their traffic through. And they may do that again. Sometimes they do that without, most of the time, I think that happens with the upstream provider that is, what I think of as the inadvertent. I love the show Ozark, so I like to talk about the Blue Pelican, which is, an example of a business that it's a legitimate business, but it's being used to, quote, launder this traffic through. A lot of times it's as simple as that. It's that they find another way to get their traffic through in a way that it looks legitimate to us because it's coming from a legitimate customer. So that's a pretty disappointing outcome, and it's one that it's not as simple as just saying, we're all going to do our very best to go after this, because there are so many pervasive ways to get around these pretty extensive standards of care that the industry has already developed. One of the challenges that we also have, though, is that, what we're talking about, all of the things I just talked about, require a lot of resources, right? We're talking about a dedicated team. We're talking about an entire organization, in Josh's case, with the industry traceback group and data scientists that are working to turn all of that data into something that's meaningful and actionable. And we don't historically, again, I think partially just because this is a new problem, we don't have a lot of great shared norms that we can all use as a baseline of what makes somebody kind of pass muster as a reputable player in the space. And it can take significant resources to develop something like that. So next slide, if you're ready, Chris, which is why, this is my illustration of this, is, we don't have what I think of as a driver's license database on a global scale. But robocalls are a global problem. Even if all of the companies in the United States, every single person sending traffic throughout the ecosystem, even if we all had to spend, all of our time and energy focused on robocalls, outside the bounds of the United States, we live in a global economy and a global internet society. So what bad guys can do is they can find a provider outside of the reach of United States law enforcement and jurisdiction, and use them, and often their relative lack of resources to do all the things that I just talked about, as a way to launder that traffic right back into US networks and get back at US providers. So we as an industry want to band together, next slide, and we realize that what we need, this is a global problem, and it requires a global solution. We need something that can be a shared standard of care, not just in the US, but all around the world, which means that it needs to be fairly simple. We're talking about a world that is really, really diverse economically. We're talking about really diverse regulatory environments, huge disparities country by country or continent by continent in terms of the different resources available, the redundancy of networks. There are some countries where there really is only 1 or 2 providers because that's all that's there. So one of the challenges that we have is figuring out, how do we develop something where we can extend this concept of know your customer and chain of trust all the way up the chain in a way that is scalable. And that's where the data comes in again. And that's my punchline. And I'm going to be handing it off to Campbell in a minute. But the story of Glitter, the story of the idea of developing a global telecommunications trust registry, is that we as an industry want to address this problem. The things that we've done have done a lot, but they have not stopped it. And what we've concluded is we need to extend farther. This is going to require a global level industry solution. And what we would like to do is create the scaffolding. What we're working on doing is creating the scaffolding to have an international chain of trust to a point where providers can actually say with confidence, I have some diligence. I've done some diligence. I've looked at the level of risk, and I've concluded that these guys get a thumbs up all the way through the call path. And that's really the only way that you can get to a scenario where you have some confidence in the call that you're taking, that there aren't potential places where the bad actors can feed in potentially bad traffic. One of the reasons why we think that it's time to do this as an industry, frankly, is because we are seeing robocallers start to pivot their attention to new countries. Just in the last 5 years, we've seen really significant consumer and regulatory action on this issue in France, in the UK, especially in Ireland and Australia, in Brazil. If there are people there who use the telephone, eventually they are going to attract the attention of these bad guys. And so we would like as an industry to avoid creating a world where every single country has their own regulatory scheme for this. But we don't think that that's a realistic outcome unless we as an industry actually affirmatively come forward and say we are doing something that is both simple and is not a heavy lift from anyone. We're not asking folks to contribute a ton of data into a system. What we're talking about is instead creating a tool by which each provider in the ecosystem can quickly, efficiently, and simply validate and assess the risk of their upstream customers, but take that upstream, not just directly upstream, but actually continue to go further and further upstream, and maybe even downstream. We want this to be something that's accessible to everyone, not just wireless providers, not just wireline providers. The goal is to create a network by which we can all leverage our collective strengths as an industry and our business relationships and create those trusted relationships all around the world. And we don't think that the way to do that is by reinventing the wheel. So what I think of as the real genius of Glitter is that it is designed to use existing data, the existing models that have been developed in other spaces when we talk about supply chain, trust in supply chain, validating the risk of the other entities that you're doing business with and accepting data from, and instead using other tools of objective data to feed all that objective data into something that can roll up into something meaningful. So we're really excited about partnering with the Industry Traceback Group, because they are working on something that is very directed and very specifically focused on robocalls. But we see the opportunity to feed other data in as well and really continue to flexibly mix that data until we as an industry land on what the right balance is to effectively validate one another in this space. And Campbell, do you want me to turn it over to you there? The next slide, it gives you a sample of what we are envisioning right now with GSMA. And when we approached them, we said, hey, do you think we could create something like this? The idea is to be able to look somebody up and very quickly get an efficient picture of who they are and what they are doing, or not they are actively participating in this global to reduce bad traffic, or whether they have a history or a track record of maybe not being so great. Campbell, I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't know how much of a detail you want to go in with this, or if you want to just keep going. I think probably just keep going.
Yeah, Campbell,
I'll unmute myself.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for that. I'll just interject one thing here, which is, from my point of view, it's fun working with Elizabeth because she's so much more creative than me. I think you get credit for the acronym, right? Glitter,
Yes.
which I don't think it quite is in the same category as Stir Shaken, which was absolutely brilliant, but it was a heck of a lot better than I could have done. And but yeah, Campbell, can you sort of maybe take it from there? Like, so what's GSMA's take on this project? What's your interest in moving it forward? How does one, join Glitter, so on and so forth? That I think it'd be great if you could run with it.
Yeah. Well, we can go to the next slide. I'll start there. So GSMA is a global trade association, and I can tell you that robocalling is very much an international issue, but it's not felt particularly equally internationally. I've told this story a couple of times. So when I first joined GSMA, I went to a regional meeting with my colleagues, and we made a list of priorities in the region, and I had robocalling as my number 2, and no one else had it on their list as a regional priority, and most folks didn't know what it was. So it just isn't felt, the US was a target-rich environment in the first place, so we got it pretty bad. But it is expanding very quickly. Brazil actually somehow gets more robocalls than we do, which is still kind of blows my mind. But as you can see, it's a patchwork of different regulatory regimes. Stir Shaken, of course, in the US and Canada. France has a similar kind of setup. Similar to what the FCC has been doing in terms of, blocking the policy, I think previously formerly known as the foreign provider prohibition, kind of similar in Australia, +61 numbers originating from outside will have to be blocked unless it, can be verified. Similar in Saudi Arabia and Oman. It's just a patchwork of regulations that, Stir Shaken is a great technology, and I'm not saying that it's not a technology, it's not that. It's just that it's not being adopted, or we're not seeing kind of that worldwide adoption that would make it more helpful in that situation. I won't say that it won't be, but one thing I like about this project is that it doesn't rely on having that. As Elizabeth said, it's a pretty simple idea, but it makes it a little bit more powerful. So next slide. So that brings me to what we're talking about today, which is the Global Telecom Trust Registry, or GLITR. When Verizon brought this to us, we decided to take it into a new thing for the GSMA, which is our Foundry. It allows for interested members and also non-members to join and be able to work on a project and build it up. We felt very strongly that because it is an international problem and it needs an international solution, that we should reach out to our international members. And so we've been in the process of talking with people around the world, a lot of our mobile operators, to see what we can do to build this up. I won't, Elizabeth did a really great job of talking about the Know Your Customer. So, I won't go too far into that, but GLITR is meant to be, an international Know Your Customer database, but also, be able to put information, like actionable information, like what Josh and his team are working on top of it, will be incredible to be able to actually maybe stop robocalling. As a GSMA Foundry project, again, it's for interested members or also other companies. There is a financial contribution involved with it, but we are working, as Chris and Elizabeth know, to keep those costs very much down. If we go to the next slide. If you are interested and want to read more about GLITR or just register your interest and get in touch, you can go to gsma.com/GLITR, GLTTR, the link down there, and we will reach back out to you and see about getting you guys involved in the project. As I said, it's sharing limited expenses in the project, and those who participate, especially right now, are going to help us determine the project scope, how we do data collection considerations. I saw a question come through from Homer, and that's kind of to that point. Is we're in early days of trying to figure out how we make this work and what is going to be the best way to do that. And data sourcing considerations are a big piece of that. But yes, if you have any more questions, gsma.com/glitter, reach out and we will be in touch.
So maybe if I could just draw out, before we turn to Sarah, for Elizabeth and Campbell, you talked about data sources and pulling in data, and maybe one of you could explain the mechanics that you envision. And I know that it's still, we're trying to not be too prescriptive until we really kind of have industry input from different sectors. But you talked about sort of bringing in something like ITG data because that's relevant to sort of having a score and some reputation information for KYC. But what other types of so you sign up, you become part of a registered database, right? And then in doing so, you hold yourself out to something, right? And you get access to data feeds. And so other than the sort of an ITG Insights, data feed, what other types of data do you envision would be candidates for sort of being accessible in the glitter context?
I think I'll start by saying, it is about, we've talked a lot about this, I think, with glitter, is that it's about, isolating in some ways bad actors, but also allowing actors to kind of come into the light, as it were. I completely agree with what Josh said earlier about it's not about them being good or bad. And part of my telling you that, this is a problem that's not felt equally around the world is to tell you that these guys aren't bad, or some people, of course, there are absolutely bad actors out there, but there's a lot of intermediate providers, the VoIP providers out there that, might be unaffected, might just, be letting kind of things go, and kind of evening the playing field a little bit to say, okay, I'm not going to let this traffic go, and my competitor probably won't either because of, the database. In terms of like bringing other information in, the FCC's robocall mitigation database is probably going to be an interesting source as well. India is pursuing something very similar, a database very similar. So pulling in kind of different sources from other governments, I think is going to be very important as we go forward.
Yeah, and so, I mean, Elizabeth, one of the things that I think you and I have talked about is the thought that we developed came out of our sort of supply chain risk management world, where, I mean, that's my day job is cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. I've been overwhelmed with robocalls because it's so much more fun, I guess. I guess that's the word. But for every other relationship that a service provider has, there's a database that you can look up. You can look up whether or not someone you're doing business with as a vendor, as a customer, as a supplier is okay with the export control regulations, whether they're using slave labor for plastic in their and what they're providing to you. You can look up whether they've been subjected to sort of litigation. And so maybe you could give me, and so I understand that part of what's really important to KYC is telecom specific data, the ITG data, but there's also sort of a whole world of reputation monitoring companies out there as well that I think we would look to sort of plug in. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Campbell, feel free to jump in here too. But I think that one of the things that we realized is that all of the data that we would want to bring into creating some kind of reputation or risk score for a company in this space, almost all of it already exists. And there are already a lot of vendors whose whole business is helping companies vet the risk of the companies in their supply chain. And so you can look at it from a supply chain management perspective, or you can look at to the financial services industry. if each one of us can have a score that the bank can get, can look up on us when they decide whether or not to give us a mortgage, whether or not I'm saying that's a good thing, is a story for another day. But what we have an opportunity to do as an industry is really put some time and effort and thought into the different data inputs. And then my favorite visual for it is act like DJs and take our mixing board and change the levels of the different data in terms of how much they're weighted in the scoring system that we come up with, until we get it right, until we have something that we say, we can all nod and say, yeah, this is effective. And this is a good place to draw a boundary between somebody who it's worth doing business with and somebody who maybe it's too risky on all of these other fronts and from a reputational and robocall standpoint.
And Chris, I know that wasn't for me, but if I can jump in and reiterate something before, why I think that idea is so important. So when you look at our data, right, we one of the things it may be indistinguishable, someone who's been in the business 20 years but had a bad week from a shell company that was stood up yesterday. That, they may look exactly the same in our data. We're trying to compensate for that in how we do our algorithms, but it's going to be an art, not a science. But that other data that is not what we're in the business of doing, not something we're skilled in, that other things of like, did this company start yesterday? And I'll tell you, there are some really bad examples. There's some where I've done just digging and they literally registered the website a week ago and now they're putting millions of calls on the phone network. There's some really terrible examples, to be clear, or in the robocall mitigation database where they filed a Chinese menu for the plan rather than an actual robocall mitigation plan. That exists. There are those. But, apart from that, we just don't have insights there. So I think exactly what Liz is talking about, there's that's where our data has huge gaps that I think need to be supplemented as people do their due diligence and can't rely just on our data.
That's what I wanted to make clear, just in terms of the mechanics of how this would fit together. And Sarah, I apologize for the detour, but yeah, I think that's kind of Verizon's vision, is that this would be APIs into data sources that industry decides are useful. And we think ITG is a crucial data source, especially just because of the subject matter. But then there's also this reputation data for which there are so many sources that I think we want to be looking to pull in. But Sarah, would love your thoughts on all of this. You've got a great perspective. You do trust and reputation for a living, right? That's your bread and butter at Numerical, and you also have carrier management background from a large service provider. So please provide your reactions to what we're talking about. I'd really like to get your thoughts on it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you're right. That's the seat and the industry I've lived in. Sort of interdisciplinary approach of running a KYC team, both now separately at Numerical and also sitting in that seat of reviewing, approving, and denying for a large voice over IP carrier. And it is hard. I mean, I reflect back on Elizabeth's comments that, some of this stuff, it's not easy. It can be whack-a-mole. You may terminate somebody from the network, but then get them through a reseller customer or intermediary customer of yours, and you may have even less recourse to do anything about it once that occurs. And now you have to work through an intermediary to try and parse out, okay, what's going on here, and you have even less knowledge of who the identity is. And I've built scoring models for risk to try and save time, pull things in for the team. And I found that, like Josh was talking about earlier, I think that's often the beginning. It's a starting point rather than an end point. It'll tell you, okay, where should I probably start looking? But it won't necessarily ever tell you, okay, once I do that, what's the end, right? It's the start, not the finish. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as we talk about all of this, is that, there's no one metric or model that's going to tell every service provider in every situation exactly the right way to act for their business. Or, as Josh was saying, there's going to be folks that, have a robust KYC program, which is designed not to never have an issue. It's designed to create that balance between risk and between, doing business and not asking everybody to scan their life's work to you prior to getting on signing a contract with you, which is never going to work, right? So it's figuring out that balance. I think I love the idea of, there's so much value that can be created for people running these customer review teams to even just have good data on the demographic information for service providers. It will save everybody time if I have a source that I can trust that says, here's the filings for this service provider here, here's where they're registered, their place of business. That stuff is all useful for everybody. I think, when we talk about, okay, what IDs might we use, how might we incorporate this with global standards, you can start to talk about things like GLIFE, sort of this global legal identity organization that already exists, which we talked about past, won't go into too much here, but there are models that exist for how we could come up with sort of a global consolidated ID that would be helpful operationally to companies in verifying certain information about their customers. I do think you're going to see concerns from service providers about, as Chris was saying, if I have a bad week, Josh was saying, if I have a bad week, but I have a robust KYC program, what does that do to my score? Or if I am sued by someone frivolously, but that's a lawsuit that happened against my company that, was resolved in my favor, what does that do to my reputation? I think the big question is going to be, what is my recourse? What's the oversight? How do if I have context, how can I add that into the conversation? And I think the last thing that service providers are just thinking about it from that perspective is, what are the boundaries, right? We have the RMD, we have all of these other, databases, we have the ITG, we have the work that's done there. Within that ecosystem, what are the sort of bounds of Glitter, and what is it trying to accomplish versus what is it not trying to accomplish and it's leaving to other entities, groups, et cetera?
Those are great thoughts, Sarah, and I think form a couple of questions that sync with some of the questions that I see coming in from the audience. Maybe I'll start with your last question of sort of what's the scope and what is it and what isn't Glitter, I guess, is the question. And I'll just note there's a question from saying, how do you address the issue of service providers and the confidentiality of their upstreams? But I don't think that Glitter necessarily has in scope the expectation that a service provider would know another service provider's upstreams. But I think it's almost like a Rorschach test. You throw out this concept and different people kind of makes assumptions about what it might be and might not be. So maybe, I don't know, Elizabeth or Campbell, if you want to kind of give your thoughts on how to define scope and sort of what it isn't in particular, I think is important.
Sure. So a couple of things, just to level set. I think one of the really key things to emphasize here is that we are not trying with Glitter to do anything new in terms of developing anything that is drawn, the industry traceback group, what you guys are doing the homework, you guys are doing the legwork, you are really digging into each individual case. What we need, and Sarah, I don't think you could have put this any better when you said we need to know that if a good actor with a robust KYC program has a bad day or gets sued frivolously, that isn't going to flag them as somebody who isn't taking appropriate measures in this space. So when I talked about flexibility and I talked about a mixing board, I think that we as an industry on a global level are better positioned than anybody else to determine and tweak and evolve the metrics that we can create out of existing data sources, and then combine them with the new insights that are coming out in this very robocall specific space like ITGs to find a sweet spot where we do have a way that Benson and Stabler can go, and even it doesn't matter where they, who the provider is around the world, they can go tappeta tappeta and find out pretty quickly a little bit, a sense of what somebody is. And then they also have the empowerment as a business to dig deeper. So they can say, oh, hey, this company looks really great on all of these metrics except for this one thing. Let me look a little bit deeper and see what that's about by following that API and taking advantage of the many different pre-existing reputation and risk monitoring companies and services that are already in business today. So I think that flexibility and the ability to evolve as the threat evolves is absolutely the most important thing in terms of success, with one exception, which is that glitter is the single, even beyond that, it needs to be able to be flexible and scalable and evolve, but it also needs to be easy. We need something that is accessible for the providers that Campbell was talking about, for whom robocalls isn't really on their radar. But if we in the United States say, hey, this is a big priority to us, will you please do this thing? We'd like to leverage our business relationship and ask you to participate in this so that we can go after this for our customers, that it's worth their while, because we're not asking for the moon. We're not asking for them to disclose a ton of sensitive data about their business or their upstream chain of trust. What we're asking them to do is participate in this baseline, get registered, and then have access to this tool that allows them to do some very basic diligence and vetting that is not capable of being done today. I mean, what Chris, what you said about the Rorschach test was so accurate for me. As I was working on this project and briefing folks throughout Verizon on what we were talking about doing, each different group that I talked to, whether it was our international roaming team, whether it was our wholesale group, whether it was our security group, each one of them had a totally different purpose and use case where they said, oh, this would be really great to have. So we're not talking about inventing the moon here. We're talking about actually kind of going a little bit back and filling in a gap. And, again, you guys have all heard my metaphors before, but what we would like to do is create an international system of roads where all the carriers that are sending our traffic on those roads have the confidence that everybody else is supposed to have a driver's license. But you can't do that if you don't have a driver's license database. You can't do that if you don't have that scaffolding in place to then be able to make those decisions. We as a collective will then have to make decisions down the road of, how do we measure when somebody needs to have their driver's license taken away? Does it need to be taken away forever? Are there different scenarios where maybe we can, as an industry, leverage some of our collective resources and help providers who have less leverage some of the knowledge and the insights that we in places where we've devoted a ton of resources to this already have more? The idea is to be able to leverage the power of data and then combine it with the power of our global business and really use those relationships. I hate to say like arm in arm like the Justice League, but a little bit that is the idea, is we've all got to make this a priority together, and I think that's the only way that we're going to solve it. And if you want to do that, you have to make it pretty easy to participate in terms of saying, yes, I am on board, and create something that is going to be useful to people and in doing business.
So yeah, and I'll just add to that for me, this project is, in part about pushing accountability upstream, but it's also pushing those tools upstream that, can help kind of solve the problem overall. But exactly what Elizabeth said.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think it's extraordinary that our industry, it's a major deficiency that we don't have a driver's license database of service providers. And it's the only relationship that I can think of where there isn't a place to look someone up and to understand who you're doing business with. And so, Josh, maybe you could pick up a little bit on sort of upstream service providers, how to think of, and maybe would also love to think a little bit about if you're creating a driver's license database. Sarah got into this. You actually do need to figure out who's who and is this entity who they say they are, kind of thing. And so would love to we don't have a ton of time, but Josh and Sarah, I'd love to circle back to you, the two of you on those two issues.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, so in Traceback, what we do, we do know the upstream. We do know those relationships. At least for U.S. providers, it's law to give us that information when we're doing a Traceback. We do take seriously the competitive reasons, the confidentiality of that there are competitive implications. But I think that's precisely why what we're working with Insights, the tools we're talking about with Glitter, they solve for that issue that was raised in the comment, because without tools, I could see a temptation of some providers saying, name every single wholesaler you work with. Their antitrust counsel might not like that, right? But if you have no other way to do that due diligence, because it is a network, because if you fire your providers, the calls still hit your network. There isn't a way to solve for that without that. So what these tools really enable is to, in a responsible way that takes into account the confidentiality, competitive concerns, getting more information out to the ecosystem to allow folks to do that. So I think that's exactly what this is about in part, is to avoid those to give tools without raising those same concerns. That exactly right. Just publishing everything, for example, an idea I don't like about Traceback gets into those competitive concerns where now you know everyone's business relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that. Sarah, maybe you could kind of jump in there. I wanted to get your thoughts as well on the same
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right. I think telecom, this whole idea of multiple entities being used to circumvent processes, it's not unique to telecom. It's something that's seen very commonly in a lot of financial fraud, and there are frameworks that have been put together in the financial industry to try and, better research and confirm relational hierarchies. And it's a bad problem in telecom. We've all had 15 spin-off entities for certain of our companies that are technically all under the same umbrella, under 5 different names for historic mergers and acquisitions reasons. It's really hard to know even, is this a net new contract I'm making, or do I already have a contract with this person but under another sub-entity of them? We're not great at it in telecom and figuring it out. And so I've worked in the financial with some of those resources in the financial industry to try and bring that in, because I want us to take those learnings and not recreate the wheel and figure out a better way to do that. And I think if we can partner with, association like Life to bring in some of those frameworks and not create them from scratch, so that, in something like Glitter, we could map those related entities out. That's a huge value add over RMD. And the other thing I wanted to point out, I mean, we talked about sort of vendor due diligence and how in other industries you can see certifications or other things that, do they do this? Do they not do this? I think another great opportunity, I don't know why it doesn't exist in telecom, but it exists in so many other industries, is if you were to open up this marketplace where third-party entities, you can't share things about your customers or your internal business practices necessarily with everybody in the industry. But if there were those that had a service where they could come in, evaluate a service provider's practices, and that independent organization provides some sort of a certification that could be published in Glitter saying, yes, I've vetted this, and provide that service both to service providers and industry, we should absolutely be exploring that, and it could be a great place to publish that information.
I think that's a great thought. You've got third parties that can analyze a company's reputation, but then you also have companies that can be brought in to look at them and certify. And I think, Elizabeth and Campbell, that the idea is to future-proof this so that, yes, one can, once you have the established registry, once you know who's who, you have a driver's license registry, then you can sort of explore and pull in that kind of data. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the important things, Sarah, you mentioned something earlier that I want to address, and I promise a minute or less, and Campbell, I'll turn it over to you. But the question of why would a provider want to be rated? I think the idea is if in the same way that I want to know if my background check turns up a bunch of stuff that isn't actually me or that doesn't make me look good, I want to know that as a person. So I think the idea is that we want providers to, we want to get the data right and have the inputs be meaningful so that somebody would actually, any provider that is doing things with a basic standard of care would actually, if there was something pinging on, where their score had dropped or changed or something, that would actually be a service to them rather than something that they would fear, right? So, but that again comes with bringing in the right relevant risk data from these other sources, from the financial, leveraging all of the good work that the financial industry has done around entity rationalization and multiplication, and then combining that with some of this telecom sector specific information and creating our own sauce that we all agree, hey, this is useful to us. It's only, that's the goal.
I have nothing more to say than I agree with that.
Okay, so we've got about a minute before Mark swoops in and does his thing to kind of close us off and send everybody to have their martinis. Any last thoughts on this? I really appreciate folks joining this panel. I think this is really exciting. Richard, okay, it's Richard swooping in. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to swoop in, and Mark will be here one way or the other. I guess, I mean, the one question I have is those of us who are in the technical standards area, is there something you're thinking about asking us to augment?
It's a good question. I don't know. Elizabeth Campbell, thoughts on that? We might take that back.
Yeah, it's something to consider. I mean, I know, at least within the Stir Shaken framework, and this is the Enterprise Summit after all. A lot of enterprises in particular have wanted more granular data delivered to them than just strict Verstat parameter. They want to see what the attestation level is, if it's A, B, or C. Was a limited discussion about, do we augment attestation itself to be more granular? And that's something folks like me and the ATTIS Forum NNI Task Force are well positioned to get involved with, and and certainly any input from GSMA into this process would be deeply, deeply appreciated.
I'll take that back.
Yeah, one thing that I'll say is that I think,
I mean, just to give you an example, once again, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., I have to do my pitch for 603 plus. Chris, I was going to do that. But 603 plus was a time to market issue, which is we needed to get the financial services industry on board with a solution to the problem that they had, and were adamant about, certainly in FCC filings. And yesterday we had a great panel on that one way or the other. So I think I speak for the forum and the NNI task force. We're prepared to step up to the plate if there's a set of requirements that Glitter needs on a forward-looking basis.
Thank you. One thing that I'll say is just that I think, Sarah, one of the things, the idea of in the future having some kind of accreditation team you know, one of the challenges about Know Your Customer and robocalls is that it is a lot, it's complex. When you look at an organization, the analysis really can't be, you know, checking a box of have you implemented X and Y and Z and Q. A lot of it has to do with the particulars of your company and what you do in the space and how big you are and where you're located and all of those things. So just thinking a little bit down the road, I think that there could be a really valuable role in the same way that colleges and universities have developed really robust and meaningful self-accreditation programs. I think that that might be a really, really relevant and helpful role for the standards bodies to play. And it may get us further as an industry than a more prescriptive list of things to do. That's just some very initial thinking, but I think that could be a very nice way to complement what we're talking about in terms of initially using just objective risk data to crunch and try to get a feel for what a company is doing, to take it to that next deeper level.
Well, Mark,
Yeah,
we're running over.
We're that's okay.
Everybody wants their martini.
It's the last session of the day. Folks can wait for their martini another minute. Not a problem. Elizabeth, Josh, Sarah, Campbell, and Chris, thank you so much.
Wonderful job, folks.
Great
Wonderful.
conversation, great discussion, and a very interesting initiative. So we're going to hear more about this, I'm absolutely sure.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
And
Thank you.
tune in tomorrow at 10 a.m. for another spirited discussion of 603 Plus.
Thanks, Richard.
Enjoy your martinis, everyone.
The gift that keeps on giving.
Goodbye, guys.
Thanks, guys.